The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that made the air feel heavy and every breath deliberate. High ceilings echoed the stern, measured voice of Judge Harrison as he prepared to deliver his final ruling in a high-profile case. The wooden benches were packed with spectators, lawyers, and reporters, all leaning forward slightly, pens poised over notepads, cameras ready to flash. The defendant sat stiffly, fingers gripping the edge of the table, while the prosecutor adjusted his tie, confident in his victory. Then, a sound. At first, it was just a faint scratching, barely noticeable beneath the judge's commanding tone. A few people in the back row glanced toward the heavy oak doors, wondering if someone was entering late. But then, the scratching turned into a thump, followed by the unmistakable creak of hinges as one door slowly swung open. All eyes turned. A dog, a scruffy, golden-furred stray with matted patches and ears that flopped unevenly, stood in the doorway, panting lightly. His ribs were slightly visible beneath his coat, and his paws were caked in dried mud, leaving faint smudges on the polished floor as he took a hesitant step forward. His tail, though wagging, moved cautiously, as if unsure of his welcome. The room fell utterly silent. Even Judge Harrison stopped speaking, his brow furrowing in confusion. The stray took another step, then another, his nails clicking softly against the marble. He moved with purpose, as though he had been here before, as though he knew exactly where he was going. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense expression, moved to intercept him, but something about the dog's demeanor made him pause. Without hesitation, the dog walked straight to the center of the courtroom, right before the judge's elevated bench. He sat down, his ears perking up, and tilted his head, first to one side, then the other, studying Judge Harrison with an intensity that seemed almost human. Then, with startling clarity, he barked. Once. A sharp, deliberate sound that made the entire room jump. Twice. Louder this time, echoing off the walls. And then, a third time. The final bark was different. Softer, almost questioning. As if he were waiting for a response. Judge Harrison's face went pale. His grip on the gavel loosened, and for the first time in his decades on the bench, he looked utterly speechless. The courtroom held its breath, the tension now electric. No one moved. No one dared to even whisper. Because something about this moment felt impossible. And then, the dog did something even stranger. He turned, not toward the exit, but toward the evidence table, where an old photograph lay among the exhibits. His nose twitched, his ears pricked forward, and with a quiet whine, he took a step toward it, as if he recognized something the rest of them couldn't see. The silence stretched. And in that moment, everyone knew, this wasn't just a stray wandering in by accident. This dog was here for a reason. Judge Harrison's usual commanding presence had vanished the moment the third bark echoed through the courtroom. His sharp eyes, normally so focused and unreadable, now flickered with something unfamiliar. Recognition, disbelief, even the faintest hint of fear. The gavel slipped from his fingers, landing with a muted thud on the bench. The sound snapped the bailiff into action, his heavy footsteps echoing as he moved to usher the dog out, but the judge's hand shot up, stopping him mid-stride. The courtroom remained frozen. Spectators exchanged uneasy glances, lawyers leaned forward in their seats, and even the stenographer's fingers hovered motionless over the keys. The dog didn't move either. He simply sat there, panting lightly, his mismatched eyes, one dark brown, the other an eerie, piercing blue, locked onto the judge. His tail gave a slow, deliberate wag, as if he knew exactly the effect he was having. Then, the judge did something no one expected. He stood. Not the usual measured rise from his seat, but an abrupt, almost unsteady movement, as if his legs had acted before his mind could process the decision. His black robe swayed as he stepped down from the bench, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden steps. The bailiff tensed, ready to intervene if needed, but Judge Harrison waved him off again, his gaze never leaving the dog. The crowd murmured as he approached the stray, his usual stern expression replaced by something far more vulnerable. His breath hitched when he got closer, his eyes tracing the dog's features, the patch of white fur on his chest, the way his left ear drooped slightly more than the right. His hands, usually so steady when signing verdicts, trembled as he reached out. The dog didn't back away. Instead, he nudged forward, pressing his wet nose into the judge's palm. A soft whine escaped him, a sound so quiet only the judge could hear it. And in that moment, something in Judge Harrison's face shifted. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then, the dog turned. He padded toward the evidence table, his tail still wagging, and stopped in front of an old photograph, one that had been submitted earlier as part of the case files. The prosecutor, who had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly stiffened. The picture showed a much younger Judge Harrison, standing beside a nearly identical golden dog, the same white patch on its chest, the same uneven ears. The room seemed to tilt. The bailiff's mouth fell open. The defense attorney's pen clattered to the floor. Even the jurors, who had been silent observers until now, leaned forward as one, their eyes darting between the dog and the photograph. Judge Harrison's breath came out in a shudder. He took a step toward the table, then another, his movements slow, as if afraid the dog, or the moment, might disappear. The dog looked up at him, gave one last, soft bark, and then sat down beside the photo, as if waiting. The dog didn't back away. Instead, he nudged forward, pressing his wet nose into the judge's palm. A soft whine escaped him, a sound so quiet only the judge could hear it. And in that moment, something in Judge Harrison's face shifted. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then, the dog turned. He padded toward the evidence table, his tail still wagging, and stopped in front of an old photograph, one that had been submitted earlier as part of the case files. The prosecutor, who had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly stiffened. The picture showed a much younger Judge Harrison, standing beside a nearly identical golden dog, the same white patch on its chest, the same uneven ears. The room seemed to tilt. The bailiff's mouth fell open. The defense attorney's pen clattered to the floor. Even the jurors, who had been silent observers until now, leaned forward as one, their eyes darting between the dog and the photograph. Judge Harrison's breath came out in a shudder. He took a step toward the table, then another, his movements slow, as if afraid the dog, or the moment, might disappear. The dog looked up at him, gave one last, soft bark, and then sat down beside the photo, as if waiting. The dog didn't back away. Instead, he nudged forward, pressing his wet nose into the judge's palm. A soft whine escaped him, a sound so quiet only the judge could hear it. And in that moment, something in Judge Harrison's face shifted. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then, the dog turned. He padded toward the evidence table, his tail still wagging, and stopped in front of an old photograph, one that had been submitted earlier as part of the case files. The prosecutor, who had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly stiffened. The picture showed a much younger Judge Harrison, standing beside a nearly identical golden dog, the same white patch on its chest, the same uneven ears. The room seemed to tilt. The bailiff's mouth fell open. The defense attorney's pen clattered to the floor. Even the jurors, who had been silent observers until now, leaned forward as one, their eyes darting between the dog and the photograph. Judge Harrison's breath came out in a shudder. He took a step toward the table, then another, his movements slow, as if afraid the dog, or the moment, might disappear. The dog looked up at him, gave one last, soft bark, and then sat down beside the photo, as if waiting. The stray, Buddy, if the rusted tag beneath his matted fur was to be believed, sniffed at the photograph, then let out a quiet, almost mournful whimper. His tail, which had been wagging steadily, stilled. He looked up at Judge Harrison, his blue eye gleaming with something that might have been recognition. The judge's throat worked silently. His fingers, usually so steady when delivering life-altering verdicts, trembled as he reached for the picture. He lifted it carefully, as if afraid it might crumble to dust in his hands. His thumb brushed over the image of the dog, his dog, and for a moment it was as if the courtroom no longer existed. Memories crashed over him in waves. Buddy, as a puppy, tumbling across the grass of his childhood home. Buddy, barking at thunderstorms, pressed close to his side for comfort. Buddy, vanishing one winter night during a storm, his bark swallowed by the wind. He'd searched for weeks, put up posters, called shelters, but the dog had never been found. Eventually, he'd given up, moved on, buried the loss beneath years of law school, then cases, then the bench. And now, here he was. Not just alive, but here, in his courtroom, on the day he'd been about to deliver a verdict that would have sent a man to prison for decades. The coincidence was too staggering to ignore. A sharp gasp broke the silence. The bailiff, who had been examining the dog's collar more closely, held up the metal tag. Beneath the grime, a phone number was still faintly visible. Judge Harrison didn't need to read it. He knew that number by heart. It was his parents' old landline, the one they'd had when he was 18. The one they'd disconnected the year after Buddy disappeared. The room seemed to spin. The dog whined again, pressing his muzzle against the judge's knee. And in that moment, something in the case, something in the entire day, felt different. Unfinished. Because Buddy hadn't just come back. He'd come back today. And Judge Harrison couldn't shake the terrifying, exhilarating thought that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't an accident. The rusted tag dangled from the bailiff's fingers, catching the fluorescent courtroom lights as they flickered overhead. A jagged crack ran through the metal where years of wear had nearly erased the engraved numbers. Yet there they were, digits Judge Harrison hadn't dialed in 23 years, numbers that belonged to a different lifetime. His chest tightened as if someone had wound a steel cable around his ribs. Buddy leaned harder against the judge's leg, his warm weight suddenly the only thing keeping Harrison grounded. The dog's breathing came quick and shallow, his flank rising and falling against the black fabric of the judge's robes. A veterinarian might have noted the signs of age, the clouding in that blue eye, the stiffness in his hips, but all Harrison saw was the miracle standing before him. His fingers moved automatically, sinking into the familiar thick fur behind Buddy's ears exactly where he'd always liked to be scratched. A murmur built in the gallery as spectators whispered behind cupped hands. The prosecutor cleared his throat, shuffling papers with unnecessary force. Normally, Harrison would have silenced the disruption with a single look, but his entire world had narrowed to the dog pressing against him and the impossible truth taking shape in his mind. Then Buddy sneezed, a wet, undignified sound that somehow broke the tension. The same old sneeze he'd always made when excited. The judge's breath caught. Without thinking, his hand slid down to examine the dog's collar properly. His thumb found what his eyes couldn't see, a nearly invisible raised scar along the leather's edge where puppy teeth had once chewed. He knew this collar. He'd been the one to fasten it the first time. The defense attorney suddenly stood, his chair scraping loudly. "Your Honor, if I might." Harrison barely heard him. His fingers kept moving, tracing the contours of Buddy's skull until they found it, the tiny, bean-shaped bump just behind the left ear where a barbed wire fence had caught him as a pup. The judge's vision blurred. His knees threatened to buckle. 23 years of grief and guilt rose like a tide, all those nights wondering if Buddy had been cold, if he'd been scared, if he'd waited for Harrison to come find him. A cell phone camera shutter clicked somewhere in the back row. The sound snapped Harrison back to the present. He straightened, wiping hastily at his face with his free hand while the other remained buried in Buddy's fur. The dog chose that moment to look up, his blue eye locking onto Harrison's with an intelligence that sent a shiver down the judge's spine. Then Buddy did something extraordinary. He turned deliberately toward the defendant's table and growled, a low, rumbling sound that hadn't been in his repertoire as a young dog. The accused man flinched so violently his elbow knocked over a water glass. Ice cubes skittered across the tabletop as the growl deepened into something Harrison had only ever heard from guard dogs. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, but Harrison held up a hand. Every lawyerly instinct screamed that he should recuse himself immediately, that no judge could remain impartial when their long-lost dog suddenly took an apparent dislike to a defendant. Yet as he looked from Buddy's bared teeth to the defendant's suddenly ashen face, Harrison realized with chilling clarity. Buddy wasn't just back. He was trying to tell him something. The growl reverberated through the courtroom like a live wire, its vibration crawling up the spines of everyone present. Buddy's lips curled back, revealing teeth yellowed with age but no less sharp. His hackles rose along his spine, transforming the once friendly stray into something primal and protective. The defendant recoiled, his chair legs shrieking against the floor as he pushed backward. Sweat bloomed across his forehead despite the courtroom's chill air conditioning. Judge Harrison's hand tightened in Buddy's fur, not to restrain him, but to steady himself. The dog's reaction was too specific, too deliberate. This wasn't random aggression. Buddy had always been gentle, the kind of dog who licked the hands of delivery men and let toddlers tug his ears. That he'd taken instant dislike to someone set off alarms in Harrison's mind that no amount of judicial decorum could silence. The prosecutor was already on his feet, documents forgotten. Your Honor, given this unprecedented development. His voice trailed off as Buddy took a single step forward, the growl dropping to a menacing rumble. The defendant's lawyer began frantically flipping through his legal pad, as if searching for precedent on canine testimony. Harrison barely heard them. His focus narrowed to the way Buddy's muscles tensed beneath his palm, the way the dog's nostrils flared as he scented the air between himself and the defendant. A memory surfaced, Buddy as a pup, growling at a handyman who'd later been arrested for burglary 3 towns over. He'd forgotten that until now. Forgotten how Buddy had always had an uncanny sense for bad intentions. The gavel lay forgotten on the bench as Harrison made his decision. "Bailiff," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "escort the jury out, please." Murmurs erupted, but one sharp look from the judge silenced them. As the jurors filed out, casting confused glances at the growling dog, Harrison turned to his clerk. "Pull the case file for State versus Riggs. Now." The clerk blinked. "That's the property dispute from this morning, Your Honor." "I know what it is." Harrison's fingers found Buddy's scar again, tracing its familiar shape as the dog finally stopped growling, though his eyes remained locked on the defendant. When the file arrived, Harrison flipped past the dry legal briefs to the evidence photos. Spread before him were images of the disputed farmland. And there, in the corner of one shot, barely noticeable unless you were looking, a dilapidated shed with a familiar red collar nailed to the doorframe like some macabre trophy. The world tilted. Harrison's stomach clenched. That collar had been Buddy's first, lost weeks before his disappearance. He'd assumed it had simply fallen off in the woods. Buddy whined softly, pressing his head against Harrison's thigh. The message was clear. This was no coincidence. The defendant wasn't just some stranger. He was connected to Buddy's disappearance. Connected to whatever had happened all those years ago in the woods behind Harrison's childhood home. The judge straightened, his robe swirling as he turned to face the defendant properly for the first time. The man's eyes darted away too quickly, his fingers kneading the edge of the table. Harrison didn't need to hear Buddy's renewed growl to know what he had to do. "Court is adjourned," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "And the district attorney will be reopening an investigation." He didn't specify which one. He didn't need to. Because after 23 years, Buddy hadn't just come home. He'd brought the truth with him.